Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. Welcome to another edition of We Table It, our first edition actually of 2025. So I'll begin by saying Happy New Year and really just grateful that you're able to be with us and join us this year as we continue to do what we do best. We look at inspiring society and dissecting society and inspiring change. So that is really what we're all about. So we welcome you to our talk today here at We Table It. And oh my goodness, how was 2024 for you? So much has happened, so many different things and experiences that we've had all around the world. And by the time the year was rounding up and we were getting ready for a new year, we've dealt with very many different occurrences around the world, starting with different natural disasters that have affected people, including fires, earthquakes, floods, changes in weather. That's just what's happening in nature around us. But also, we can't deny that everyone in the world, different people, different countries, will face a certain impact in some way with the new presidency that's taking place in the United States. So there's a lot to watch there. And I mean, just very many different things that are going on. So, as all of those are going on, my hope is that you are keeping well, that everything is okay, and that you're able to manage your day to day. And especially just excited for what's going to happen in Africa in 2025. So, Africa is set, I believe, to really be revolutionary. I think a lot of things are going to happen that are going to change the course of life for many people. We have seen that 2024 was a year of, the starting up of a fire, the year of ignition, the year where things sort of started to take shape. And now we're in the space where, as Africans, we are looking at making them continue to take shape, and as people around the world watching and seeing what is happening, and also cheering us on when it appears that we are doing something right in order to continue to advance ourselves and our countries. And so, to start off the year, I thought it would be good for us to explore an interesting topic, right? And even before we go in, for those who don't know me, my name is Valerie Siganga. I'm one of the hosts here at We Table It. I am supported with two additional hosts who are Eno Enukpo and Osaro Aibugun. So they're the hosts who are normally with us. Sometimes you'll see us all together, and other times you'll see us as individuals, just talking about different topics and occurrences that are happening around the world. Now, if you want to find us and listen to our previous talks and our current talks, you can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, as well as on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So we're across all platforms, including TikTok. So you'll be able to find us there. I urge you as we go on, if you hear something that resonates with you, if you have a question, please remember to like, follow, or subscribe to our pages. If you have a question, just put it in the comments and we will definitely get to it and respond to it. If you want to watch us live, we go live on Facebook as well as on YouTube. So you're very, very welcome to our talk today. And before we really jump into what it is that we want to talk about, let me give you a hint as to the topic. So, our topic today is really something that is interesting and close to me. And I'll tell you why. I'm a digital marketer. So, a lot of the work that I do is on digital platforms and digital spaces. And that's what really had me thinking about what was happening on digital spaces in 2024 and as we're moving into 2025. So the talk that I'm going to have, that is the foundation and basis of it. Looking at understanding what really happened digitally in different countries and specifically in my country, Kenya. And the name of the talk today is really looking at the digital art or the digital age, of protest. Okay, where we want to look at the spark of revolution. So we're looking at how is it that digital platforms are able to spark revolution or move people towards revolution. And this is something that we witnessed and experienced and lived through in Kenya last year. In previous talks on We Table It, as it was happening, we were talking about it. So if you want to get some more in-depth information on what we talked about and what we addressed, please go look at some of our previous talks. You can find our full playlist on YouTube, and you will get some insight into what was happening live through this digital revolution. But today, and over a series of 3 talks, I'm going to actually really do a deep dive into the digital art age of protest. What is it, and how is it that it's really making an impact in the world, not just for Kenya, but for other countries as well. So thank you for joining me for this. Now, where do I actually begin? And I'll tell you what inspired me when I was reading and researching and living through this and trying to understand it. There's a book that came to mind, and that is Sun Tzu, The Art of War. And I was like, war has a strategy to it, you know? And for a while, when we were having protests and things happening on digital platforms, it felt as though literally people were getting ready to go to war. And so I read this book to understand strategy, planning. What is it that is considered that goes into war? And I found that there's a lot of places that the digital engagement and digital actions were crossing, or is the word crossing? Yes, we're crossing with what happens in strategy, in getting ready for war, as is explained in this book, The Art of War. And so that's what really inspired me to start talking about this, and just give some insight into what my thoughts were, and particularly what my thoughts are for digital platforms, digital marketing, digital communication. So that was the inspiration for today's talk. Now, I'll start with a few, I'll say, disclaimers or points of interest that you can consider as we go through this talk. And this came from having conversations with different people and seeking to understand their insight on what they thought about this age of revolution that we're in, where we're using digital platforms to protest, as when we're unhappy about something or a process that's happening in different countries or even companies, places, just as a place where we can voice opinions. And one thing became very clear about digital platforms, and that is that digital platforms unite people. They bring people together, regardless of your culture, regardless of your creed, regardless of your color, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of where you live, what you do. All those barriers to communication that typically exist in society are removed on digital platforms. People are able to engage with each other, no matter who it is that they are. So the first thing that they do is really bring people together. And they bring people together in a way that is, purely organic. People come together not because of what they look like, what they do, any of that, because they have similar interests, because they want the same thing, because they oppose the same thing, because they oppose each other. I mean, it doesn't matter how you look at it, but it brings people together and allows them to have conversations. So that's the first, I think, tool of power when it comes to digital platforms and digital communication. And then I had to actually sit for a moment and think about a country. And in this case, my country, or the country that I'm from, which is Kenya. And the thing is, Kenya, as we go through this digital age of revolution, it's become clear that Kenya is actually not a physical place. Now, I'll explain what that means, because even when I thought about it and it was brought up to me, I had to wrap my mind around it. How is Kenya not physical? I mean, we have a map. We know where we are on the map. We know where we are in the continent of Africa. We can tell you our land size. I mean, you can find us. You know where Kenya is. But the world is evolving and the world has changed. So when we talk about Kenya today, we know that there is a place that is called Kenya, but Kenya, I think, is also an identity. And I'll give you an example. Kenyans are patriotic, they're strong, they're connected to their motherland, and you'll find them everywhere in the world. And one of the ways that it becomes possible and easy to connect with a Kenyan is by looking at their wrist, because many of us Kenyans wear a wristband that has the colors of our flag and the shield of our flag. That means that where we're going in different parts of the world, in different interactions with people, we carry Kenya with us. So Kenya becomes an identity more than just a place. Now, why is this important when we look at a digital age of protest and digital things happening? It means that a Kenyan does not necessarily have to be in the physical space of Kenya in order to voice their opinions, in order to protest, in order to be seen and heard, and more importantly, also in order to be physically identified by other Kenyans in different spaces. So when we look at what's happening online, it's important to understand that, yes, there's what we call qua ground, which is on the ground, physically in Kenya. There's activities that happen there, but they're equally important as activities that happen on digital platforms that may not necessarily be on the ground in Kenya, but involve Kenyans who are spread around the world. So the world has stopped being so much more than just the physical places that we come from, but it's about our identities that we carry with us when we spread ourselves out. In a way, it's almost like saying Kenya is everywhere. And just to touch on that a little bit more, this past weekend, we had the rugby sevens that were taking place in Perth, Australia. And there was a very exuberant, excited, patriotic team of Kenyan supporters who were there to support the players with music, with song, with cheers. And I saw different stories on TikTok, people asking, which is the country that is most vocal, most supported? And they would say, oh, it's the Kenyans, because as an identity, we're able to come together in different places and actually showcase that identity. So that's what Kenya is about. And that's why it's important to understand digitally, where do we fall in? Because we're more than being in one place. All right. And fighting for a country today is not physical as it was years ago. So I'll explain that. And that's not to discount any physical wars with the use of, live weapons and ammunitions. That's really not to discount that. But it's almost to look and see and add one more dimension. And what is this dimension? This dimension is that people are able to communicate with each other in real time across thousands of miles. When we're going to, when people are going to object, to go to war, they don't need to be in one place for that to happen. So it's important for people to remember that now, the way the world is, wars can be fought in different ways. They can be done in different spaces. Now, there's one thing, right? Other than just Kenya being a place or an identity that can be found everywhere, I think there's something also that connects people to different countries. And if anybody's wondering if this talk is purely about Kenya, I'll say yes, there's a lot of elements of Kenya, but it also applies to other countries as well. And just for reference, I'll be mentioning Kenya repeatedly. So apply whatever country you're from to what I'm talking about, and I'm sure that it'll make sense. So now we have what we call a shared Kenya story. When I was working in corporate and employed in different companies, the word we'd use is trauma bonding, where whatever traumas you're going through bring you together as people. So here I'm calling it the shared Kenyan story, where there's something that we all agree on or disagree on that brings us together, so that we're able to bond. So that if you meet with any Kenyan, anywhere in the world, anywhere in the country, and you spark a conversation about this one shared story, you'll find that you can bond with the person and that you can talk for hours. And excuse me. I'll give an example of one shared story. So one of them is, for example, when services are not up to par, particularly from public institutions where there's possibly a lack of service, there's neglect, there's time taking, there is lack of clarity. So that forms part of the Kenyan story, where you're able to meet with someone and say, "Oh, I went to this office and experienced this." And they're like, "Oh my goodness, it's like this as well in a different office. So that's part of that Kenyan experience, the Kenyan story. And then there's also another part of the Kenyan story that is now evolving that I think we should look at and see how is it that we can grow from this story. And that is a story where we're beholden to certain services, certain service providers, because there's nobody else. A big one being, for example, electricity. So there's one main company that offers electricity in the country. When electricity is there, we are okay. And then when electricity goes, there's only one person that we can talk about. So we'll always refer to the company by name and give our grievances in conversation. So that shared Kenyan story also helps to unite people, right? And then digitally, and this is before I really dive into what I want to talk about today, I think digitally, Kenya already has what I'll call an army. We have a strong army. Long time ago, before the brand change, we used to be called KOT, Kenyans on Twitter, who are a force to be reckoned with when it came to fighting for a right, speaking up, addressing one issue at a time. We really have been a force to reckon with. And now that has evolved. I don't know whether we're now called Kenyans on X. I'm not sure what our abbreviation is, but there's still this online army that is highly united, whether positively sometimes, whether negatively, but it's united. And our impact in those spaces cannot be underrated. For example, there was a time that CNN made a statement that they should not have made, and the Kenyans on Twitter went out and actually made sure to send messages, communication to CNN to say, no, what you did was wrong. And they needed to issue an apology. So that is really the power of what it is that people can accomplish when they're using digital platforms. All right. And now, here, one of the things I think that is driving Kenyans to really, really look at digital platforms as a way to get results where other platforms have made it not possible is using the internet as a tool for accountability, right? So that is what it is that is happening right now. The internet is actually creating space where we can ask others to be accountable, to talk about what it is that they're doing, and make sure they're standing in the space of integrity. All right. So, yes, those were some disclaimers. I kind of went into it a little bit deeper than I wanted to, but those are some disclaimers that sort of lead into what it is that we're going to be talking today about. And that is the spark of revolution. How did this revolution sort of come out? And when I think about modern warfare, why am I looking at this revolution as a way of what's happening in terms of modern warfare? So back to Sun Tzu, when I was looking at the art of war, in that book, there's lessons that battles are won not just with having heavy weaponry, but also with making sure that you incorporate strategy, you have intelligence, and that you're able to adapt to whatever situation it is that you're facing. Now, last year in 2024, I think we witnessed as Kenyans a modern form of that warfare. And this means that we went to war, in a sense, online, not with swords, not with guns, but really with hashtags, with viral videos, and mass digital mobilization. So, those are the tools, the strategies that were used to get our leaders to listen to what was actually affecting people in the country on the ground. And all this sparked up by what we call the Finance Bill 2024. And it was a landmark document that was meant to help the government raise revenue. It was a strategy for them to raise more revenue. However, it had different provisions in them that led to people actually getting more angry than being accepting of new rules and regulations that were put in place in a way that was supposed to, at that time, and through that logic, elevate life by helping the government raise revenue. Okay. So, what it actually sparked was a new wave of digital activism, you know? And what was interesting about this new wave of activism is that it was led primarily by the youth. Young people, I think it even has a name, which was the Gen Z unrest, the Gen Z revolution. It was named that because it's people who are young, the young generation, our young people who are coming out of schools, universities, first workers, who decided that they needed to use this way, this platform, in order to be heard. And there was a reason for that. And we're going to dive into that right away. Before we do, I'll say if you do have any questions, any comments, anything that you'd like to say, you can put them in our comment section and we'll be happy to address and jump in and just share what your thoughts are on this talk. So I'll begin with the Finance Bill 2024, and specifically for anyone who's not heard about it before. So every year, the government releases a finance bill that helps to guide how finances for the next financial year will be spent in the country. And it talks about where the revenue is going to come from and where the revenue is going to go in order to meet whatever expenses are needed for the operation of the country. And often it is through a finance bill every year that increases in tax and the like are done. And so normally we wait for, once the finance bill is gone, often than not, prices are likely to go up for certain commodities. And for others, they're going to potentially go down. But more often than not, they stay the same or they go up, I think, more than going down. And what triggered the protests that took place nationwide in Kenya was, in reviewing this bill, it appeared like the taxes that were going to be increased would lead to an economic strain on the citizens of the country. But also, there was that perception that the government was being insensitive to the concerns of the public. Because before the protests became physical protests, there was a significant amount of digital protesting and how it went. And, there's a lot that happened to make sure voices were heard digitally. And when that didn't work, then it became relevant to have a physical protest. But here we're going to talk about what was the digital protest like. So looking at the Finance Bill 2024, there was a lot of information contained in it. And I'll just touch on 2 or 3 things that caused discomfort, unrest that people wanted to have addressed. So there was a proposed increase in the taxes for essential goods. That included some food items, fuel, and what that would actually do is make day-to-day life more expensive for ordinary Kenyans. Kenyans were supposed to take on a mandatory housing levy that would take a 1.5% salary deduction from your gross salary. And it was to affect both employed and self-employed individuals. Business taxes were set to go up through a higher turnover tax that would affect small businesses, which mainly operate in an informal sector that on a day-to-day is actually struggling. And other levies, such as levies on digital transactions, as an example, were set to go up as well. There was a whole host of other taxes that were going to be highly impactful on day-to-day operation, living, and just being able to live comfortably as Kenyans. Okay. Now, before a bill is actually passed, it goes through several stages of public participation where people are able to voice their concerns and hopefully have those addressed so that then the bill can be passed, but their concerns are taken into consideration. So, what happened in Kenya that led to this digital revolution sparking and really starting something that none of us could have anticipated where it would have reached? Okay. It started with, all right, guys, there's a finance bill coming out. We are not very happy with it. So have you read it? And one of the first things that came out or that happened online is people sharing this finance bill, getting other people to read the digital version of it, understand it, and understand where the discomfort was coming in. So it started like that, using digital platforms. And I'll focus particularly on the ones that I was active on, such as Twitter, or sorry, X and TikTok, where information we were being urged to read this finance bill, understand what's in it, and understand what's not working within it. And we need to raise these issues so that they can be addressed. And in Kenya, we've got members of parliament who are the ones who sit and discuss and add and take away and, really go through the bills. So it started off with that, sharing the information, understanding it, and people becoming aware of what within the document was not going to work for them, right? And then we went into a whole new level of something that I'll call hashtag warfare. And what happened here is that there were certain hashtags, such as hashtag reject finance bill 2024, hashtag occupy parliament, that started being used to share this message, right? And why were we using hashtags? Why was it that the youth wanted to have this message really understood? The power of a hashtag, first of all, is that it allows information to build momentum. So by using hashtags, it makes it possible for more and more people to be able to see a message and then actually, take an action based on that message. So that's where everything started, really starting off with the hashtags. Now, once hashtags gain momentum, the benefit is it's possible to get global attention. The attention you get is no longer just localized, but it becomes globalized. And this ties into what I said at the very beginning of the talk. Is Kenya a physical place or is Kenya an identity? You know? And when you have a hashtag, it alerts people from all over the world, including other Kenyans, what is happening in Kenya and that they need to know about it, need to understand it. So it started off with hashtag warfare. And then from there, we moved on because from that hashtag warfare, what was the result? The news was out there. There was information that had gone out. But fundamentally, what the information was supposed to do was spark a change with the finance bill. And that did not happen immediately. So something else started to happen online, right? And that is citizen journalism. So we have journalism that's done by professional journalists who talk about different issues, give us stories, and give us news. But there was generally, I think, some distrust with the mainstream media at the time, where the information that people wanted to hear and wanted to be out there in terms of really dissecting what the bill was about was not coming out as clearly. And also, I think there was distrust in mainstream media, where young people thought that there are certain mainstream media platforms or houses which are controlled by factions within the government. And that would then limit the way the news would come out. So citizens took it upon themselves to offer journalistic information. And what young people would do was create explainer videos that they would share on TikTok. There was information that was being shared on Instagram and Twitter. There was documenting of events. There was fact checking of what the government was claiming. And also importantly, there was exposés of human rights violations. So citizens decided to come up and actually become journalists in a sense of sharing information and telling stories of what was happening in the lead up, to the finance bill being tabled. And following that, then it became even more frustrating, I think, for people because here they were using the avenues that they could to get their message out there digitally, talking about what is happening, what it is that they're experiencing, and not getting the response that they are being listened to, that they are being heard, and that there's something that could be done about it. There's a way that this situation could be resolved. And so the next thing was mobilization, where there was a sudden rush of digital mobilization, bringing as many people as possible together to then take an assertive physical action. And that physical action, we saw it play out in the protests. But before people went out on the street, there was something that was happening in the background. So there was coordinated actions that were taken using posters, scheduling of protests, sharing safety tips, sharing information, really just sharing what is supposed to happen on which day and where, and sharing this far and wide so that everybody would have access to information that talks about these are protests that's going to take place. It's going to take place on this day, at this time, in this place. Please make sure that you come. Giving people information on what to come with. I think it was a bottle of water, your phone, very simple things, because it was not supposed to be a violent protest, but rather a peaceful protest that brought out people's voices. And so digitally, there was a mass mobilization that took place. And how do we know that this mass mobilization in terms of digital age of protest was effective? I think there was one significant protest that saw hundreds of thousands of people showing up to protest. So it's an indication that just sharing the message digitally was able to mobilize all of these people from different walks of life, different parts of the country, because it took place in the capital. People physically came to protest because of mobilization that happened on digital platforms and digital communication. So it just speaks to the power and the tools of that direct sort of communication. And then from there, we had our physical protests. Now, there was more happening online that was actually sparking more information, more engagement, trying to get voices heard. And the next thing that happened on digital platforms was based on mobile communication and sending information. So when the protests were taking place, there was also something else taking place online, where information from members of parliament, different government leaders, different leaders actually who were influential in the process of the finance bill, representatives of the people, their phone numbers were shared on social platforms to enable individual citizens to reach out to them directly. Now, in Kenya, we have mobile money that's called M-Pesa, which you can send people money on mobile platforms. But before you send the money, you get a message that verifies that the person that you're sending to is really the person you want to send to. So it'll give you their name. And in order to get that information, you need to send something. So what the young activists who were using digital platforms did was, in order to confirm they were actually reaching the member of parliament that they were supposed to, they would send a nominal amount of money, a shilling, which is the equivalent of 1 US cent or less, to the member of parliament to confirm that this really is the person, and then they would send whatever message that they wanted to send as their civic duty. And so we could see the effect, because the members of parliament came out and said they had received tens of thousands of messages from young Kenyans who were voicing dissatisfaction, who were voicing their thoughts, who are actually sharing what it is that they thought could be improved about what was happening with the finance bill. So when the digital platforms of social media were not giving the results that were expected, then the next step was finding another way to get those messages out. And that was directly to the person's phone, really sending as many messages as they could to the people that represent them so that their voices could be heard. Okay. Now, this is where we say that the digital age of protest is also tied to accountability. you know, those messages were shared so that people could know that they can be held accountable. And the people in this instance are the leaders. So it was important for them to know that it's possible to hold you accountable for the work that you're supposed to be doing. And this is the one way that it can be done, using digital platforms. And so this was a way of really that direct information. Remember at the very beginning, I'll just take you back to the beginning of the talk when I said that digital platforms unite people across all walks of life, whether it is your culture, your social impact, wherever you're living, your economic status. Using digital platforms, you're able to unite across everyone. So this also opened up a different type of accountability with leaders, and telling them that what it is that they were doing that was were not satisfied with, they could actually be directly affected by the people and thoughts of the people. And in order to really support what was being done, people made posts, they shared videos, they shared with each other on these digital platforms their testimonies of engaging with these people directly, what feedback they got, what a specific leader said or did not say. In some cases, they recorded phone calls where some were able to reach these leaders through phone calls and shared what it is that the leaders were talking about and responding to. They shared screenshots to show that they had done their civic duty and communicated with the leaders in their areas. So, this digital engagement took on not just accountability for the leaders, but also accountability for the people who were engaging. Okay. Now, just a little bit on Sun Tzu's The Art of War, where I think this sort of what was happening just was so interesting. Is in The Art of War, there's a place that talks about striking at weaknesses. And I think what the digital youth or Kenyan youth were able to do was identify and target what would cause discomfort with the members of parliament so that they directly feel what it is that people were experiencing. And so using digital platforms and actually getting to somebody directly, because that's not something that I think is easy anywhere in the world. But it became possible through digital engagement and digital sharing. It was possible to communicate that. As a member of parliament, you're under public scrutiny. It is widespread, it is direct, and people will comment on what it is that you're doing. You can be reached, you know? So I think that was something that was just not anticipated in terms of what could potentially happen when people are protesting or that form of protest. In my personal experience, it was something new. I've not seen or experienced this. But I will also say that when it comes to protesting and really speaking out and having my voice heard, I think this was the first year that I have done that. Previous years, I've been more of an observer, but in my experience, this was not something that was the norm. So it just goes to speak to what is potentially possible on digital platforms and what they would be able to achieve. Okay. And so, yes, I'll say if you have any questions, any comments, if you had an experience at this time that you went through on these different digital platforms, and you are doing something actively and you'd like to share what it is you were able to do and accomplish, please do so. Share in the comments, ask any questions. And yes, so I'm going to have a sip of coffee before we go to the next segment. On this, our coffee chatter, where we talk about different things that are impacting society. And so next, I'll talk about really what else happened on social platforms, in addition to really laying down this battleground, the beginning of, I wouldn't say it's like the beginning of the battle. How is it that the disruption was sparked? What were those things that were happening before we went out really fully on digital platforms and took advantage of what they were able to offer to communicate with Kenyans and with the world? So this, what I've mentioned, is a touch of where it began. And now I'll go into the next phase. and which was very interesting, I think, for me, even experiencing it. And that was civic education. Okay. Now, civic education is education that teaches you about your country, your policies, your laws, your people, all of that, civic education. And when I was going to school, in primary school and secondary school in Kenya, we did do civic education as a subject. But I think from high school moving forward, it's one of those things that, unless you're looking for the information, it might not be a priority. And for me as a person, it really was not much of a priority, really, civic education, understanding what was happening. But that all shifted in 2024 for me. And I think now I am all for civic education in any way that I can get information and understand what's going to affect me, my life, my business, my family's lives. That's important. And I get my information from digital platforms. So I'll talk about something interesting that happened on Instagram as a form of civic education. So when the finance bill is written and sent out, it's normally in one language, and that is English. But Kenya, as a country, has more than 40 tribes of people. Each tribe has their own languages and also subdialects within the languages. So we've got a rich amount of native languages, that people speak. And depending on where people live and what education that they have been able to access, the fluency in English may vary from one person to the next. Same even with fluency in our national language, Kiswahili. But for many Kenyans, they are fluent in I'll call it their native language, their mother tongue, the language of where they come from, they're fluent in that. So, understanding that there was a communication gap, and this is something that came through young activists online, they did the next best thing to make sure that the information that was being shared about what was not working well in the finance bill could reach as many people in the country as possible. So, individuals set up an Instagram page that was able to have the finance bill, our key points within finance bill, translated from English into various different native languages, so that if you were with somebody who did not speak English, they were able to hear key points about the finance bill in a language that they understood through social media. And what this did was open up a whole new door for inclusivity, because it meant that people who typically would have been left out in the past are now no longer being left out. They're able to be part of the conversation to understand what is happening. And it was supported with graphics, it was supported with short videos. It simplified some of the complex policies to make them more understandable. So civic education took a turn because it was no longer about just talking about what's in the finance bill, but it took on making sure that it's not about me as a person who knows it, it's about me and the people who I love and the people who are in my community and the people who could be affected and the country at large. So digital engagement was able to make that possible in real time. It did not need what I'll call like a paid campaign. It just needed people wanting to communicate, and they did. And then we saw another huge tool being used for civic education at the time, and that was X Spaces. And X Spaces became a tool to bring people together from very many different countries. And the beauty about X Spaces is anybody could join in, whether most of the attendees were typically Kenyan, but it allowed people from other countries as well to jump in and hear the discussion on what was happening here on the ground. And it mobilized for individuals who were looking for information on what was happening and what needed to be done. The X Spaces helped bring together key influencers. It brought together activists. It brought together people who had deeper understanding from a technical level on what was happening to share that information with the general citizen through different talks that would take place. And these X Spaces would take place almost on a daily basis, really sharing information, but also allowing people to speak and be heard, you know? So it was not discriminatory to just certain people. Everybody who wanted to speak would be given an opportunity to do so, even if that meant that the X space would take place for hours. But people had the opportunity to share their thoughts, to voice their frustrations, to speak on their pain, to speak on what they were not happy about. And the different activists who were recognized on these platforms, particularly X, were moderators of these talks. So they would be able to set up a talk, because when an activist sets it up, then everybody wants to be part of the conversation and hear what is being said, and they would then join the talk. So these talks would attract hundreds of thousands of people. You know, I think I've been in X spaces that had 60,000 people, upwards of 200,000 people, really in the same space, talking, listening, giving their opinions, and helping to, allow people to shape the narrative that they wanted to follow through with, right? Because everything was happening as it was happening. So as a person trying to form your opinion, these spaces allowed you to get information and decide for yourself what it is that you wanted to do with that information. So X spaces became important for civic education, important for discussions, important for people to share their outlook on what was happening. They just opened up doors for that. And how do we know the impact of these X spaces was huge? You know, I mentioned that X spaces were taking place almost on a daily basis. And there was a lot of unrest, a lot of discontent, and a lot of questions. And these questions were being directed at the leaders. So remember, it started off with people directing messages to their members of parliament, and then sharing of information of leaders, especially in government in different categories, requesting for information and sharing their frustrations. But ultimately, people wanted to hear from our president, particularly after the physical protests turned violent. People wanted to have an engagement with the president. The president did come out with press releases and TV interviews, but he did something which I think was really unprecedented in terms of participating with the people. But what it also underscored was the importance of engaging with people on digital platforms. And that is when the president decided, if people are communicating and talking on the X platform, then he should also hold an X space, giving him the opportunity to speak directly with the people who are on digital platforms. And that is what happened. Our president actually held his own X space, and he was able to speak, and people were able to ask questions and share their information. Of course, it was not typical that it would take as many hours as would normally happen, but it did happen. Now, as a Kenyan, I'm not sure whether either before or after there's been any world leader who has gone onto an X space to speak directly to their people, listen to their direct critiques invisibly, because on X it's just your profile picture and your name and you're able to speak. You know, I'm not sure if that has happened anywhere else in the world, but I think it was probably a first. And it was just speaking to how, even as a world leader, even with all the resources that you have available for you, when it comes to the digital age of protest, it's important to engage with people where they were. And that is the action that was taken at the time, you know? And then that really allows for some understanding, some dialogue, information to flow. What happens after the information flows, that is people's individual choices that come to play. But the point is, this is the power of this digital age of protest, what it's been able to achieve, you know? And it points to adaptability in communication. Here, when we look at consolidating support, it's possible to speak to very many different audiences when you're on a digital platform, and thus mobilize and consolidate that support. So we're becoming more adaptable in communication. It's not just about being spoken to and being told this is what we're doing and this is where we're doing it and you need to accept it. But communication now involves saying as a leader what it is that you want to implement, and giving the people an opportunity to speak back directly and tell you whether they like what you're saying, whether they don't like what they're saying, they're comfortable, they're uncomfortable. Actually hearing those voices is now possible through digital platforms. Now, one more thing that I'd like to touch on today when it comes to digital campaigns, and I think something that made them pretty powerful at the beginning of the protests. There's a lot that's happened since then, so this might, when we talk about it in the next coming talk, we'll touch on that. But at the beginning, the campaigns were completely leaderless, completely, almost, you'd say it was an anonymous campaign. It was just people coming together, speaking, making sure that their voices were heard on different digital platforms. So I'd mentioned that there was something that was happening with hashtags at the very beginning, where it was like hashtag warfare. That was the tool that was being used. And just as an example, the hashtag Reject Finance Bill 2024 received over 3 million impressions, making it a hashtag that trended in different parts of the world and not just in Kenya. So this opens up communication to other people in the world to understand what's happening in Kenya and go and look and see, and takes the news from just being local news to gaining international attention. Now, why is this important? And particularly in this scenario, as a country, I believe that we don't operate as a silo. Like many other countries, we are influenced by decisions made by other countries, by partnerships made with other countries. And it becomes important to communicate what is happening really on the ground in these countries. But this communication is unlikely to come from, let's say, the source of where the challenge is. So it opened up um, room to actually reach out to organizations, to countries, to governments, to embassies, to influential people directly, and tell them, okay, this is what is happening. This is why we are rejecting our finance bill. To news outlets around the world, we would like you to come and cover this, would like you to talk about this. That's what an anonymous campaign was able to achieve. We were able to have the hashtag trending for several days. And it really allowed focus to come into this was the problem that was going on. Okay. And then in Kenya, in terms of mobilization of the physical protesters, there were a lot of posters that were being shared and campaigns for these posters, so that when you would see them, you would know what was going to happen on a specific day and where people were expected to be. They were highly effective, in sharing information and making sure that moving and change was possible. They were, going viral. And we also had a new space for influencers. So influencers, we know, and social media influencers typically do paid campaigns where they talk about whatever products or services that they're promoting to their audiences. But here we saw people willing and able to do campaigns for the protests, talk about them, share information, share their involvement, not as a paid campaign, but as a civic duty, So we saw influencers stand up into their spaces and reach the people who listen and engage with them and tell them about what was going wrong and why it was important to protest. Okay. And then a last point I'll talk about is what happened internationally outside of Kenya's borders. Now, remember, Kenya is an identity. Kenya is not a place as it was before, but we do have physical spaces where you will find Kenya. In Kenya, it is the whole country is our physical space. When we go outside our country, then we're looking at interacting in our embassies, in our missions abroad. And so, what Kenyans did outside of the country, when you go into the diaspora, is that they organized their own demonstrations, aligning with the demonstrations and protests that were happening in different parts of Kenya, Nairobi, and all the different cities in Kenya, because they were nationwide. They also held their protests there. They shared taglines that were linked to the protests that were taking place here and made sure that their voices were heard as well. So what that did is it allowed the international attention to actually grow a little bit more than it had been just here in Kenya. But it was the same Kenyans who were able to make that possible. So digitally, if this information had not been shared on digital platforms, it would have not been possible for even mobilization to take place in all of these different countries. But Kenyans were able to do that and stand up and gain international attention. They were able to take up their civic duty and protest as well. And they made a continental, in fact, I can't even call it continental, I'll say a global movement that asked for accountability, right? And what that does is speak to really when you're going into battle, and this is also from the book that I was reading, The Art of War. You need to look at this war beyond the possibility of defeat. Defeat is not something that should be happening. You look beyond it. And I think this is something that Kenyans were able to do well in this stage. So able to look beyond the possibility of defeat. They looked at, all right, we are simply in this fight. So the only thing that we can do is fight. And we can only fight in this way, and we will keep fighting. And digital platforms were able to make that possible. And what that did was make sure there was pressure internationally, make sure there was resistance and pressure locally, but also when you have people from one place going to battle all around the world, it gives the cause legitimacy. It stops just being a group of people, in quotes, complaining, but it becomes a legitimate movement, a legitimate rise in a revolution. And yes, I think I will pause there for today, and I'll just give you some insight on what we'll talk about the next time we meet. So today we've talked about what is it that sparked the revolution? What are those things that happen digitally on mobile phones that got to this revolution starting to take place? We've touched on what happened, and here I'm really giving from my experience and my observation. I'm sure there's a lot more, but this is what I can remember now in terms of mobilization, communication, bringing people together. What did that look like? And how is it that a digital platform where people normally share memes, they share funny videos, they share their opinions on, different sort of things that are happening in the world, on food, on businesses, on whatever it is, how did those platforms become tools for civic engagement, civic education, making governments accountable? How were they actually turned into these types of tools? It's not something that sort of happened overnight, but it's something where there was looking at the internet, there's looking at what you need and seeing how can I use what I have available to me for the purpose of accountability, for the purpose of my voice being heard, for the purpose of spreading a powerful message. It was making sure that the tool adapts to what it is that was needed for it at the time. So that, I think, is what started the spark of this revolution and how it was possible to mobilize millions of people online to go forward to take specific actions that would get voices heard. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that we're going to do it in three parts. This first part was looking at what sparked the revolution. How is it that we started? When we meet again in the coming week, it'll be the same time, Wednesday, 7 p.m. East African time. we'll be looking at digital tactics and specifically what was happening that caused disruption and what was the counteraction. Because when you consider going to any sort of battle or war, you don't just go in, fight on your own, and it ends there. Every action has a reaction. And we're going to look at what were the disruptive tactics that were taken and what was the counteraction by the other side, the opposition. We'll call them the opposition or other forces. So we'll talk about what that looked like on a digital platform, what people's experiences were. And then the third talk will really talk about what were the victories, what were the lessons learned, and what were the dark turns. Because in everything, there's also the good as well as the bad. So there's some things that went very well, and there's some things that just went south. So we're going to talk and discuss that. And this talk will take place every Wednesday for the next upcoming 2 Wednesdays. It's a lot of information to unpack. We might need some more time, but it is definitely worth remembering and worth listening to. If you're hearing about this for the first time, I'd urge you to go online, do some research, read up, and find out more about what was happening in Kenya last year with our Gen Z protests. Rejecting the finance bill. The protest goes on till today. It changes direction, but it has not stopped. So definitely on the path of a revolution and something being done differently. And if you have any insights on how information was being shared on digital platforms, or really the impact, even not so much how much information was shared, but your experienced impact of digital engagement and digital platforms, you can reach out to us and share. We'd be happy to hear from you and happy to continue exploring this topic. So I thank you all for joining me today for this talk. Thank you very much. And I'll urge you, if you've not followed any of our pages, or if you liked the contents of this talk, please make sure you like, subscribe, follow the different pages that we have online. We would love to hear from you as we continue exploring different societies and looking at what is dissecting society at the moment and how it is that we can inform and inspire change. And yes, if you have any questions, any comments, anything that you'd like to touch on, please go into the comments. You can send us a DM as well, and we'd be happy to speak with you. And also, if you'd like to be featured or a guest on one of our talks, please feel free to come in. Thank you so much for joining us or for joining me this evening. And I wish you the best and look forward to seeing you in the coming week. Thank you and have a great evening.